Me and Chris Waugh here at the MKM Stadium to review Newcastle United's 2-0 victory over Hull City in a pre-season friendly. What did you make of that, Chris, then?
Well, it was very pre-season friendly quite early on in pre-season. I thought Newcastle at times in the first half, their sort of big players sort of turned up, and I think the real positive, which it wouldn't be for Alexander Isak that he wasn't at the Euros, is that he gets a full pre-season with Newcastle and he already looks very sharp. We know how vital he is for Newcastle, and even if there are other areas of the team which you do have minor concerns about in terms of depth and players not being back yet, haven't been at the Euros, and sort of how tired they might be, he looks sharp. And Jacob Murphy looked very good on the right. I mean, Newcastle want a right winger. You would like to think that they will have another right winger by the start of the season, but Jacob Murphy, with those crosses that he does, they've become almost trademark, low into the box. That looks like a positive. I mean, there are other areas which are a bit more concerning, but I thought that those two in particular in attack, you can see how important in particular Isak once again is going to be for Newcastle United.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing was there was plenty of link up with him and Barnes in a sort of like, it was a 4-3-3 that turned 4-4-2 at times, particularly in the first half. There was a good link up between the pair of them. Do you think that could be quite crucial this season, provided that Anthony Gordon's still here at Newcastle?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the big thing. I suspect that Anthony Gordon will be, but obviously we know that there were talks with Liverpool and that he potentially maybe has had his head turned. I mean, we haven't seen the best of Harvey Barnes yet in a Newcastle United shirt. Yeah. There were glimpses last season, obviously the West Ham game and a few others, but he spoke to us out in Germany last week and he said about how it was stop-start for him. He didn't have a full pre-season last year. It takes a while to get used to Howe's system. He became a father for the first time last year, as well as the injury, and he said he never felt like he was at 100%. Harvey Barnes going into this season, hopefully we'll see a lot more. I think that he is still going to be one of those players who will frustrate from times. He will be a match winner, or he won't really do anything. That tends to be how his career's gone so far. Howe will try and extract more from him. But him and Anthony Gordon pushing each other every week if they're fit, that is an exciting prospect, because Anthony Gordon obviously was Newcastle's, in my opinion, most important player last season. But if he's got someone like Barnes he can dovetail with, that really is an exciting prospect. And theoretically, as we saw towards the end of last season, the two of those plus Isak can play. It means Gordon shifts off from the left, but still as a fluid front three, that's quite an exciting prospect.
Do you think that Lewis Hall playing in the midfield and playing as a sort of number 6, when there's lots of talk about Newcastle needing a number 6 over the last 2 years or certainly 18 months, that could be a thing for this season? Or do you think that was just purely a sort of very pre-season thing to see, to get the defence the way it was? Because obviously we were debating before the kick-off about how Eddie Howe was going to line up the team, and you know, we kind of came to the conclusion that Hall was going to play in midfield, but it didn't seem obvious. So what do you think about the prospects of that happening more often?
Well, I mean, Lewis Hall himself, throughout most of his Chelsea youth career, played in midfield. I think that it's been a psychological adjustment for him as much as learning the position of left back. It was a bit odd to see so many fullbacks in the starting lineup, but Newcastle have a lack of options at the moment, given who is unavailable because they haven't returned from national duty yet, or because who aren't fully fit yet. And so I think it was more a needs must. I don't think you're likely to see Lewis Hall there regularly, but it's an option that they have. And I mean, actually, he played there for about half an hour. Then Newcastle shifted a little bit, and it was almost like a 3-4-3 at times, where and it shifted in and out of possession, but Lewis Hall went to sort of left back and Jamal Lewis went to almost a sort of left wing back role. So I mean, even Jamal Lewis being on there and playing says a lot about where Newcastle are at in terms of bodies and potential need for strength and depth going forward. But I think Lewis Hall, it's an interesting option. You can see how good he is on the ball. That's what I think you notice most obviously with him. Whether he is physical enough to be in that midfield, I think it's not an option which I would suspect Eddie Howe would want to use regularly, but it is a potential option going forward, given the injuries they've got with Lewis Miley and others. To know that Lewis Hall can go in there and you can give him the ball and he will try and make things happen. But I think that they've started on the transition to make him a left back, and I think it would be a backwards move in terms of that development to play him regularly in midfield if you see him as a left back going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The other thing before we get on to the sort of the elephant in the room, which is the press conference we've just heard from Eddie Howe and Nick Pope after the game. The other thing to mention is that there was no Longstaff or Joe Willock, and we were told before the game that was purely just because of managing their load, and no Lloyd Kelly as well. So there was no new signings, you know, not counting Hall obviously as a permanent deal, in the starting 11. Do you think that there's concerns over that? I mean, we were discussing Willock before the game, and it's still not ready, still not fully fit. Is that a concern?
I think there is an element of concern there. I mean, I also understand why Newcastle would be cautious to make sure that he is right, but they've taken a long time to try and get him right. I suppose the concern would come in that I specifically asked Eddie Howe about Willock, and he said that he's very close to being ready and hopes to be ready for the start of the season. But does he have enough time to get enough minutes into his legs to really be ready to start the season in the way you would want Joe Willock to have that sort of dynamic, explosive running power that he has? That is a bit of a concern, particularly given that Newcastle are very light in midfield. I mean, Bruno Guimaraes is going to return and join them in Japan. Theoretically, Sean Longstaff, again, it's not serious and he is training. But Lewis Miley is going to be out for another month, 2 months. Newcastle do actually look relatively light in that position. Obviously, Sandro Tonali will come back at the end of August. But from a position before they'd lost Elliot Anderson, where you thought they had a lot of options, right now, in the height of pre-season, it doesn't quite look that way. So hopefully Howe suggested that you may see minutes from Willock in Japan, and you'd like to think that you will, because he's going to need a few games to get up to any sort of decent shape, given how little football he's played over the last year or so. Yeah,
he did say though, Eddie Howe, that he looks like he's in the best physical shape he's been in for a long time, Willock. The big thing to talk about though is obviously we're coming into this game off the back of Eddie Howe's conversation in Germany, which you were there, and you were sort of, we know that the press were quite taken aback by how brash he was. I don't really think he eased that in he wasn't as brash and out there with his comments, but he also sort of doubled down on things, said nothing's close, talked about collaboration and not the final say and all that sort of thing. So he was touching on it and making sure that it's still in the realm and in the sort of sphere and everything, and still in the conversation, wasn't he?
I think to an extent. I mean, it's probably difficult for people who weren't in the room in Germany. In Germany, the tone was different. I thought his body language was different. Today, I think he was very much more focused on speaking about his players, speaking about the situation. He certainly didn't want to inflame the situation anymore. He didn't necessarily douse the flames, for want of a better term. I mean, he talked about collaboration, and I think that's the big thing for him. He was asked specifically, do you want final say on transfers? And he actually said, no, it's not so much about that, it's about making sure it's a collaborative process. He wants to be involved in these discussions. He wants to feel that he has some sort of sway over what is going on, if not necessarily always the final say. It's about that sort of collective approach. But you could tell, I think, the undertone of what he said, and he didn't actually say it, but I think almost what he didn't say is that the lack of transfer progress is a frustration. You just have to look at the sort of players he had on the bench today. It was full of under-21s, and I said there's various reasons why that's the case, and other players will come back. But Newcastle materially stronger as a squad than they ended last season, and I think it's hard to argue that they are at this stage. They haven't made the big signings in the positions they needed. They've brought in Lloyd Kelly, who we haven't seen yet. Hopefully we will soon. Again, they're working on his fitness, but Newcastle haven't strengthened at right forward. They're down Callum Wilson at the moment, who's had an injection in his back, and Howe suggests he's going to miss the start of the new season, and that could affect transfer plans, because if they can't move Callum Wilson on, can they bring a striker in? And also at centre back, they're still very light. Emil Crafter's doing a good job there, but he's not a centre back, and that is a concern for me, that they are this close to the start of the season, and given we know that it takes a lot of players time to really bed into Eddie Howe's system, especially coming from abroad, and I think that Newcastle will be looking to exploit those markets, because A, Paul Mitchell's come in, but B, given the cost of signing players domestically, and that is a bit of a concern. It's not just the fact that Newcastle could sign someone before the start of the season, it's are they going to be ready, how far into the season before they're ready to actually produce in the way Newcastle needs. So I think Howe was more diplomatic maybe than he was last week, but still with the undertones of keeping the pressure on a little bit, and I think it's almost like keeping his thoughts to himself for now, and then seeing how Newcastle develop over the next couple of weeks. They may make big signings, that may help him, but if in 2 weeks' time Newcastle haven't made the signings Howe wants, it would not surprise me if you heard another outburst. the other thing to say, I mean, I said on one of these videos that the England job's kind of irrelevant until it's offered. I think we said that before the game. But I just want to put this to you, that basically lots of fans, I think, are sort of looking at it out from the outside and thinking that the Paul Mitchell situation coming in as sort of I wouldn't say bull in a china shop, but he's coming with a big sort of reputation for recruitment, which is obviously going to encroach on Eddie Howe. The fact that he's brought then James Bunce in as somebody he knows, so there's a sort of already a little gap there to sort of sew up, a little bridge to come there. Then Staveley leaves, and that's the sort of thing that Eddie that's going to affect Eddie Howe in terms of an ally in the boardroom, and all of this is sort of creating an undertone of
of frustration and uncertainty, and there's been talk of Kevin Keegan and Rafa Benitez comparisons from 2008 and 2018. That seems a little bit far, but do you sort of see that? How do you sort of view that whole situation for Eddie Howe in a more general sense?
I don't think it's close to those situations yet, but I think it's something which is ongoing. And Howe spoke about last week. He talked about the need to develop these relationships and establish these boundaries. And until they work in practice or don't work in practice, you won't know the exact answers to that. And I think what was almost lost to a certain degree from Howe, what he said in Germany, was that when he first came in, he was asked about the England job and he almost had a prepared sort of answer. And I think at that point he thought that a lot of the questions would move away from England and would be about Newcastle. And I think it was almost lost in translation both ways, that actually when you sat back and thought about the situation, Eddie Howe wanted to talk about Newcastle. He wants to be at Newcastle United. He wants this to work. And so I think this was almost a public plea from him to basically try and outline to everyone that he wants to stay at Newcastle United. He wants this to be a long-term continuation of the relationship they have so far. But if that's to work, and if he's to feel like it can work, he still needs to have the capacity to operate in the way that he feels he needs to be successful. And I think that was sort of lost to a certain degree. I don't think it was so much a rant in terms of it didn't have a background to it. I think the England job was a useful sort of springboard for him to make that point, but actually he didn't want to speak about the England job. A lot of the questions that came his way were about the England job, because that's the sort of mindset a lot of the journalists went in on. So I don't think we're at that stage yet, but I do think the next 3-4 weeks in the transfer market will be telling. How is ultimately going to be the one who's judged on results, and if he goes into the new season without really a materially strengthened squad, then he could understandably feel like he's been hung out to dry a little bit in terms of the situation. So I do think that once a couple of signings arrive, the whole situation will be diffused, at least in the short term. That's what I suspect will happen, but until those signings arrive, it still feels like there's tension there.
Yeah, and then England come to the table and offer him a contract, right. and then he's got a decision to make. I think that's the ultimate thing. Do you think that the England situation, final question, has slightly shifted? I think there's a lot of conversation, but I think if you spoke to the press pack last year, you had said, the whole thing about him wanting to coach on the grass and he loves Newcastle, he's relocated, all still true, but it feels like there has been a slight shift in that maybe because of the situation at Newcastle, maybe if the job is offered, then he might have something to think about.
Potentially. I mean, it's just one of those things. I've always thought all along that it's very different being linked to the job to actually being offered. Could he say no to the job? He suggested in Germany he could. Yeah. I suppose it will depend on if England do come in from what has happened in the course of the next few weeks. If no signings have arrived and he then thinks, well, actually, I'm almost a lame duck here, and I feel that if he fears that a sack could arrive in the next few months, then maybe he jumps ship to England. But I do think he wants to be at Newcastle. I do think this is the job that he wants. I think that if he was to receive some of the players that he wants, if he was to receive some of the assurances that he wants, I could actually see him turning down the England job. So there's a lot of imponderables there and questions we just simply don't know the answer to. But I do think this, for him, as he was generally trying to reiterate last week, is more about Newcastle and the want for it to work at Newcastle. But then England is an alternative option if all of that fails.
Brilliant. Cheers, Chris. I'll be back on Monday with the Monday show. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then. Cheers.